How are we doing today? I've lost count of how many days we've been at the stay-at-home order, and as people consider moving out of that time, it's tough. It's tough to have counted all the days and now to imagine what might come next. When people experience a hurt, it changes who they are. A relationship, a friendship, a mom or a dad who treated them a certain way, a sickness. We know that love also does this, love or the lack of it. It creates a new quality of relationship or of life. Sometimes a large event impacts people of an entire generation, and from that comes new practices or new initiatives or new ways of being. Now, there are days these days where I feel numb. There are days these days where I generally feel happy. There are days these days where I am also sad and I despair. And I wonder how these days will impact my life going forward. What ways of being now in this moment will create ripples we'll feel further on? What will the scars be that this pandemic forms, not just on me, but on our society? How will this change us? How has it already changed you? Now, I recognize that I carry a certain amount of privilege. So far, these impacts of the coronavirus have not touched directly the people that I know, from a physical health perspective, that is. There are untold ways that this has impacted people. And the way that I cope with uncertainty, I have learned, is that I try to imagine what the world will be like when this is all played out a little bit more. My way to cope with uncertainty is to try to imagine a world where there is more certainty. And you probably have some different way of coping as well. But no matter what, I don't want to go back to the way things were. I don't want to go back to normal because normal wasn't real. Sonia Renee Taylor, who wrote a book called, I think it was The Body Keeps Score, reminds us of this. She writes, "We will not go back to normal. Normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was not normal, other than normalized greed, inequity, exhaustion, depletion. What else was it? It was extraction, disconnection, confusion, rage, hoarding, hate, and lack. We should not long to return to normal. We are being given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all of humanity and nature." Mike Small, inspired by Sonia Renee Taylor, writes this: "If previous generations faced the harrowing experience of war, we are experiencing the trauma of pandemic and the new cultures it is throwing up. The task for later will be to challenge inevitability, cultivate outrage, and imagine different futures. But it will also be to reorient towards doing less." So what do we do with this crisis? Please note, I am not talking about what I'm deeming pandemic productivity. I'm talking about the ways our society has changed. I'm not talking about individual productivity because that seems strange. I'm talking about collective change. So I go back to Mother's Day and the flower ceremony. What do they have to teach us about collective change? They are largely the result of two individuals' responses to traumatic events and ways of processing. Now, Julia Ward Howe's Mother's Day proclamation came from her convictions as a pacifist and as a feminist. Historian and journalist Heather Cox Richardson reminds us, when the sheer enormity of the death caused by the Civil War and also the Franco-Prussian War convinced American women that women must take control of politics from the men who had permitted such carnage. Mother's Day was not designed to encourage people to be nice to their mothers. It was part of women's efforts to gain power to change modern society. After witnessing these atrocities, Howe wrote, I was visited by a sudden feeling of the cruel and unnecessary character of the contest. It seemed to me a return to barbarism, the issue having been one which might easily have been settled without bloodshed. The question forced itself upon me. Why do the mothers of mankind, why do not the mothers of mankind interfere in these matters to prevent the waste of that human life which they alone know and bear the cost? These words written with such power, as we heard, arise, women, say firmly, we will not have great questions decided by irrelevant agencies. Our husbands shall not come home to us reeking with carnage for caresses and applause. Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all we have been able to teach them of charity, mercy, and patience. We, women of one country, will be too tender of those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs. Now, these modern expressions of Mother's Day do not directly come from Julie Ward Howe's Mother's Day, though it is likely that the founder of the modern Mother's Day, Anna Jarvis, saw her mother celebrating Howe's version of the Mother's Day for Peace. And now the flower ceremony. It's a distinctly Unitarian tradition, though there were some examples of the flower ceremony celebrated in Midwestern congregations. This one comes from Norbert Chopek. And Reginald Zatoli writes this about the flower ceremony, sometimes called the flower communion, which was created by Norbert Chopek, who founded the Unitarian Church in Czechoslovakia. He introduced this special service to that church on June 4th, 1923. For some time, he felt the need for some symbolic ritual that would bind people more closely together. The format had to be one that would not alienate any who had forsaken other religious traditions. The traditional Christian communion service with bread and wine was unacceptable to members of his congregation because of their strong reaction against the Catholic faith. So he turned to the native beauty of their countryside for elements of a communion which would be genuine to them. This simple service was the result. It was such a success that it was held yearly just before the summer recess of the church. This came from a need to bind people together across religious differences. Of course, the word religion is believed to have roots in the words meaning to bind again, at least according to Tom Harper and Joseph Campbell. We know that eventually Chopek was put to death by the Nazis and became a martyr for our faith. Richard Henry, in a biography of Chopek, wrote, his faith was a sun-drenched pre-Holocaust faith, one that sustained thousands of his compatriots during the darkness of the Nazi occupation. His faith enabled him to endure his own martyrdom with an equanimity and heroism confirmed by survivors of the concentration camp in Dachau who knew him there. What meaning do we take from these rituals in this time and place? Both Chopek and Howe were people of deep conviction who took the values they held throughout their life and took action on those values. Friends, may we all be a people of deep conviction so that when we act, people take notice.